London, 1988. A smoky Soho bar, a 12-year-old boy with trembling hands, and the secret that would change everything. When Freddie Mercury leaned close to the blonde child sitting at the grimy piano and whispered, "Don't stop, darling. I'm here with you now." Time froze for young Leo. But what nobody in that crowded bar knew, not the drunken patrons, not the sneering manager, not even the boy himself, was that Freddie hadn't stumbled into that establishment by accident. He'd come hunting for truth, and what he found would expose a darkness that had been hiding in plain sight for over a year. Leo Morrison was 12 years old, rail-thin, with shock blonde hair that hung over frightened blue eyes. His small frame was drowning in a second-hand jacket 3 sizes too large, the sleeves rolled up to reveal wrists so thin they looked like they might snap. He sat at the piano stool like a prisoner at an execution, his entire body trembling with a fear that went far deeper than stage fright. This wasn't performance anxiety, this was survival terror. In the damp basement beneath the bar, lying on a mattress surrounded by mold and rats, was Leo's 7-year-old sister Mia. She had a fever that had been climbing for 3 days. She needed medicine. She needed a doctor. She needed help that Leo couldn't provide because every penny he earned went straight into the cruel hands of Peter Sharp, the bar's manager and the architect of their nightmare. But to understand how 2 children ended up living in a rat-infested basement, performing like trained animals for their supper, you need to go back. Back to when their lives were different. Back before everything fell apart. Catherine Morrison had been a piano teacher in Kensington, living a modest but comfortable life with her 2 children in a small flat near Holland Park. She wasn't wealthy, but she had something more valuable, a small inheritance from her late mother, that would ensure Leo and Mia could attend good schools, have opportunities, build futures. Catherine was also something else that almost nobody knew about. She had been part of London's music scene in the early 1970s, performing in small venues, crossing paths with musicians who would later become legends. One of those musicians had been a young Farrokh Bulsara before the world knew him as Freddie Mercury. They'd shared stages at tiny clubs, collaborated on arrangements, talked for hours about music's power to heal and transform. When Farrokh became Freddie and Queen exploded into global fame, they'd lost touch as people do when their paths diverge dramatically. But Catherine had followed his career with genuine happiness for her old friend's success. In early 1987, Catherine met Peter Sharp at a community music event. He seemed charming, successful, interested in supporting local music education. He offered to help promote Catherine's piano teaching services through his network of entertainment venues. Catherine, trusting and kind, accepted his help. What she didn't know was that Peter Sharp was a con artist who had been watching her for months, researching her background, identifying her as a target. He'd learned about her inheritance, her property, her complete lack of family support system, and he'd begun laying an elaborate trap. Over the following months, Peter systematically inserted himself into Catherine's life. He forged documents suggesting she owed him money for promotional services she'd never authorized. He created fake contracts with her signature. He built a paper trail of debt that existed only in his manufactured reality. Then, in January 1988, Peter made his move. Using his connections with corrupt officials and the falsified documents he'd created, he had Catherine arrested on fraud charges. The accusations were entirely fabricated, but the legal system moved slowly, and Catherine couldn't afford proper legal representation. While Catherine sat in a holding facility awaiting trial, Peter obtained temporary custody of Leo and Mia through more forged documents claiming Catherine had designated him as guardian. The children, confused and terrified, were told their mother had abandoned them, that she'd been involved in criminal activity, that she'd specifically requested they never try to contact her. It was a complete lie. But Leo and Mia were children, alone and scared, with no one to tell them the truth. Peter moved them into the basement of his Soho bar, a decrepit establishment called the Twisted Key that catered to the worst kind of clientele, people too drunk or too desperate to care about 2 traumatized children being exploited before their eyes. Peter discovered that Leo could play piano, Catherine had taught both her children, and Leo had inherited his mother's gift. Peter saw opportunity. He forced Leo to perform nightly, using Mia's safety as leverage. Play well, and the crowd is happy. You both get to stay in the basement, Peter would say, his breath reeking of whiskey and cruelty. Play badly or refuse, and I'll put your sick sister out on the street. Winter's cold, Leo. She wouldn't last a night. For 11 months, this had been Leo's reality. Play piano for drunks, clean tables, scrub floors, keep Mia alive. Hope somehow their mother would return. Survive one more day. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, the regular pianist hadn't shown up, and Peter was drunk and angry. Tonight, Peter had grabbed Leo with unusual violence and thrown him toward the piano. "You're playing Bohemian Rhapsody tonight," Peter snarled. "Full version. And if you mess it up, if one person complains, you're both done here. Understand?" Leo understood. He understood that Peter was choosing an impossible song deliberately. He understood that Peter wanted him to fail. What Leo didn't understand was why. Freddie Mercury had been sitting in the darkest corner of the Twisted Key for 3 hours, nursing a single glass of whiskey, watching everything with the focused intensity that had made him one of the greatest performers in rock history. He was dressed to be invisible leather jacket, jeans, sunglasses despite the dim lighting, a cap pulled low over his distinctive hair. Nobody had recognized him. Nobody had paid attention to the solitary figure in the corner. But Freddie had been paying attention to everything. He'd been tracking Peter Sharp for 2 weeks, ever since a private investigator he'd hired had finally located Catherine Morrison in a women's detention facility in Essex. Catherine had been there for 11 months, her case deliberately stalled in bureaucratic limbo by officials Peter had bribed. She'd been trying desperately to get messages to her children, but every attempt had been blocked. When Freddie learned what had happened to his old friend, the fabricated charges, the stolen children, the complete destruction of her life, something inside him had turned to ice-cold fury. Freddie Mercury was dying. He knew it, though few others did yet. The disease ravaging his body was winning, and there wasn't much time left, but he'd be damned if he'd spend his remaining days letting evil flourish unchallenged. He'd used his wealth and connections to hire the best lawyers, the best investigators, the best of everything to unravel Peter's web of lies. They'd gathered evidence, built a legal case, located Catherine, and prepared to strike. But Freddie had insisted on being here tonight, on seeing with his own eyes what Peter had done to Catherine's children. And what he was witnessing made his blood boil. Leo's trembling fingers touched the piano keys. The opening notes of Bohemian Rhapsody drifted softly through the bar, barely audible over the conversation and clinking glasses. The melody was delicate, vulnerable, just like the child playing it. For the first minute, nobody paid much attention. Then Leo's playing grew more confident, and a few people near the piano fell silent, listening. The boy had genuine talent, obvious even through his fear. But when Leo reached the operatic section, the technically demanding middle part that even professional pianists found challenging, disaster struck. From the front table, directly in Leo's line of sight, a drunk man stood up and shouted, "This kid's supposed to entertain us? He can barely reach the keys. Get him off there and bring us another round." Laughter erupted. Other patrons joined in the mockery. "Child labor," someone yelled. "Where's the real musician?" Leo's concentration shattered. His fingers fumbled, producing a harsh, discordant note that cut through the room like a scream. He tried to recover, but panic had taken over. His hands froze above the keys. Tears began streaming down his face, dripping onto the yellowed ivory keys. From the bar, Peter smiled. This was exactly what he'd wanted. He'd deliberately chosen an impossible song, deliberately seated the loudest drunks right in front of the piano, deliberately orchestrated Leo's humiliation. Because Peter didn't just want to exploit these children, he wanted to break them completely. In his twisted mind, broken children were easier to control. But Peter Sharp had made one critical mistake. He hadn't noticed the man in the leather jacket standing up in the corner. He hadn't seen that man remove his sunglasses, revealing eyes that burned with righteous fury. He hadn't recognized until it was too late that Freddie Mercury had just entered the game. Freddie crossed the bar in swift, purposeful strides. The crowd parted without knowing why, just sensing the authority radiating from this stranger. He reached the piano where Leo sat frozen, tears falling, awaiting Peter's punishment. Freddie gently placed his hand on Leo's shoulder. The boy flinched, expecting violence. Instead, he heard the softest voice, a voice that somehow carried both strength and infinite kindness. "Is there room for me, darling?" Leo looked up, confused. Through his tears, he saw a face that was familiar from posters, from television, from the album covers his mother used to play. But it couldn't be. Why would Freddie Mercury be in this terrible place? I don't understand," Leo whispered. Freddie sat down on the piano bench beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "You were playing beautifully," Freddie said, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "But this song, it's rather difficult to play alone. May I help you finish it?" The bar had gone completely silent. People were starting to recognize the stranger at the piano. Phones, the bulky mobile phones of 1988, were being pulled from bags. Someone whispered, Is that really him?" Peter Sharp, standing behind the bar, felt the first flutter of genuine fear. This wasn't part of his plan. This wasn't controllable. Freddie's hands settled on the bass keys. "Look at me, Leo," he said softly. "Not at them. Just at me. We're going to play this together, and it's going to be magnificent. Ready?" Leo nodded, unable to speak. "From the top of the operatic section," Freddie instructed. "I'll anchor the bass. You carry the melody. And Leo, whatever happens, don't stop. I'm here. You're safe now." Those last 3 words, "you're safe now," broke something open in Leo's chest. For 11 months, he hadn't been safe. For 11 months, every moment had been survival, terror, uncertainty. But sitting beside this legend, feeling the warmth of another human being who wasn't there to hurt or exploit him, Leo felt something he'd almost forgotten. Hope. Freddie's fingers struck the opening chords of the operatic section with absolute authority. The cheap, poorly maintained piano suddenly sounded like a concert grand. His bass notes provided a foundation so solid, so unshakable, that Leo's trembling melody could soar above it without fear of falling. They played together, and it was magic. Leo's hands steadied. His fear transformed into focus. He was still crying, but now they were different tears. Tears of release, of relief, of finally not being alone. The operatic section built to its climax, Galileo, Galileo, Figaro. And instead of fumbling, Leo nailed every note. Freddie's harmonies supported him, guided him, lifted him. The bar full of drunks and cynics sat in stunned silence, witnessing something none of them would ever forget. When they reached the hard rock section, Freddie began singing. That voice, the voice that had filled stadiums, that had made Bohemian Rhapsody immortal, poured out in that dingy Soho bar. He sang with full power, holding nothing back, giving this performance the same intensity he gave to Wembley Stadium. People were crying. Hardened drinkers who hadn't felt genuine emotion in years found tears streaming down their faces. The drunk who had mocked Leo sat with his head in his hands, ashamed. As the song built toward its gentle conclusion, Freddie's voice softened, becoming tender and protective. Leo played the final notes, and they hung in the air like a benediction. Silence. Complete, absolute silence. Then the bar erupted. People were on their feet, applauding, cheering, some openly weeping. It wasn't just the performance, though, that had been extraordinary. It was witnessing the moment when cruelty was defeated by kindness, when power was used to protect rather than exploit, when a legend reminded everyone what it meant to be human. Freddie stood, pulling Leo to his feet beside him. He raised the boy's hand high, presenting him to the crowd like the champion he was. "This child," Freddie announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the bar, "is a hero. He's been surviving impossible circumstances with courage that would break most adults. And tonight, that ends." He turned to look directly at Peter Sharp, who stood behind the bar, face pale, understanding that his world was about to collapse. "I know what you've done, Peter," Freddie said, his voice dropping to something cold and dangerous. "I know about Catherine Morrison. I know about the forged documents. I know about the bribes, the lies, the systematic destruction of an innocent woman's life so you could steal her property and exploit her children." Peter started to protest, but Freddie continued louder now. "I also know that you didn't expect anyone to care. You counted on Catherine being alone, on these children being invisible, on nobody powerful enough to stop you." Freddie smiled, but there was nothing warm in it. You counted wrong. The bar's door opened. Through it walked two police detectives, a social worker, and behind them Leo gasped, his hand flying to his mouth, his mother. Catherine Morrison looked older, thinner, worn down by 11 months of hell. But the moment she saw her children, all that fell away. She was just a mother who'd been separated from her babies. Mum? Leo whispered, unable to believe his eyes. Leo. Catherine rushed forward, gathering her son into her arms. Oh, my darling boy, I'm here. I'm here. I never left you. I never stopped fighting to get back to you, Mia. Leo sobbed into his mother's shoulder. Mia's downstairs. She's sick. She needs help. I know, sweetheart, Catherine said, smoothing his hair. The ambulance is already here for her. She's going to be fine. You're both going to be fine. The detectives were already moving toward Peter, who'd gone from pale to ashen. Freddie had provided them with mountains of evidence, financial records showing Peter's embezzlement, testimony from officials he'd bribed, proof of the forged documents, everything needed to ensure Peter Sharp would spend the next decade in prison. As Peter was led away in handcuffs, Freddie walked over to where Catherine held her son. Hello, Catherine, Freddie said softly. It's been too long. Catherine looked up, recognizing her old friend through her tears. Freddie, you did all this? Music connects people across time, darling, Freddie replied, touching her cheek gently. You were my friend when I was nobody. When I learned what happened to you, did you really think I'd do nothing? In the days that followed, the full story emerged. Freddie had spent over $100,000 of his personal fortune on lawyers, investigators, and bribes of his own, the legal kind, to expedite Catherine's release. He'd personally guaranteed her legal fees, arranged for her property to be restored, and established a trust fund for Leo and Mia's education. More than that, he'd given them something money couldn't buy: justice. Peter Sharp was convicted on multiple charges. The corrupt officials he'd bribed were exposed and removed from office. The legal system that had failed Catherine was forced to acknowledge its failures. Mia recovered fully from her illness. The family moved into a proper home. Catherine resumed teaching piano, though she'd never charge struggling students again. Freddie's generosity had removed the financial pressure that made her vulnerable to predators like Peter. Leo continued playing piano, eventually attending the Royal Academy of Music on the scholarship Freddie arranged. But he never became a famous performer. Instead, he became a music therapist, working with traumatized children, helping them find healing through music the way Freddie had helped him. What the public never knew, what even Catherine and Leo didn't learn until years later, was that Freddie had been diagnosed with AIDS just weeks before he learned about Catherine's situation. He was already sick, already dying, already facing the reality that his time was limited. He could have spent those precious remaining months focused solely on his own comfort, his own legacy, his own affairs. Instead, he chose to spend time, energy, and resources saving a friend he hadn't seen in 15 years and her children he'd never met. When Brian May asked him why he was pushing himself so hard when he should be resting, Freddie's answer was simple: because I can, because they need help and I can provide it. What else should I be doing with whatever time remains? Counting my money? Perfecting my legend? Darling, I'd rather be remembered as someone who gave a damn. Freddie Mercury died 3 years after that night in the Twisted Key. His final album, Innuendo, had already been recorded. His affairs were in order. His legacy was secure. But to Leo Morrison, now a 46-year-old music therapist working with traumatized children in East London, Freddie's legacy is something different. It's in every child Leo helps find their voice again. It's in every moment he sits beside a frightened kid at a piano and says, "Don't worry, I'm here. You're safe now." It's in the understanding that true power isn't about dominating others. It's about using whatever strength you have to protect those who can't protect themselves. The Twisted Key Bar closed 6 months after Peter's arrest. The building was eventually demolished. Where it once stood is now a small community music center, funded by an anonymous donation. Everyone knows it was Freddie, though this was never confirmed. On rainy London nights, People who live near the old Soho location sometimes claim they can hear piano music drifting through the streets. They say it sounds like two players, one strong and confident, one young and learning, playing Bohemian Rhapsody in perfect harmony. It's just a legend, of course, a romantic story about ghosts and music and magic. But Leo knows differently. Every time he sits beside a traumatized child at a piano, every time he provides the safety and support that child desperately needs, he feels Freddie beside him. Not literally, not as a ghost, but as a presence, a reminder, a mission. Music is a bridge, Freddie had told him that night. Sometimes to hearts, sometimes to the road that leads you home. For Leo, music became the bridge between his broken past and his purpose-filled present. And every child he helps cross that bridge is another note in the song Freddie started playing that rainy night in 1988. A song that will never end, as long as someone is willing to sit beside the frightened, the exploited, the forgotten, and whisper, "Don't stop, darling. I'm here with you now." That's the real legacy. Not the stadium performances or the record sales or the iconic mustache, but the quiet moments when power chooses kindness, when fame chooses service. When a dying rock star spends his precious remaining time saving children he'll never see grow up. Freddie Mercury once said the show must go on. What he demonstrated through actions was something deeper. The show must go on, but it means nothing if we forget to care for each other while the music plays. In a damp basement beneath a terrible bar, a 12-year-old boy learned that lesson, and he's been teaching it to others ever since.